So let's begin by bowing in and welcome everyone to the Buddhist Path of Awakening. The course, and we're going to be covering chapters 55 and 56, I think, is that right? Of the book, The Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma by Trungpa Rinpoche. Yeah. Chapter 55 is the last chapter on the second noble truth. Excuse me. Yeah. Having to do with suffering, the origin of suffering. And the chapter 56 is the first chapter on the third noble truth, which is the cessation of suffering. These are profound subjects, and we're going to start now. Michael is going to present, and then I'm going to follow him. So Michael, take it away.
Okay. I think I found last week that my computer does not compete well with other devices, but if everyone stays muted, hopefully we won't have the sound problems we did last week. Before beginning to talk about this chapter, Perpetually Recreating Suffering, I just wanted to remind people of a point that was made in the previous week's reading, that suffering begins with loss of awareness or absent-mindedness. Because tonight we're going to go into some of what happens when we lose awareness, some of the results, some of what follows from loss of awareness, in particular by looking at the kleshas and then looking at karma, kunjang of karma. This chapter in my mind is really packed. There's a lot of meaning in every sentence. That's often true, but it's really true for this one. Even in the beginning, the very first sentence, the origin of suffering, kunjang, is based on the belief in eternity. And in particular, out of this belief in eternity comes the hope of maintaining oneself, of continuing to be, and the search for longevity of the self or ego. So right from the start, we're talking about loss of awareness in the sense of fixating on a sense of self, which at the same time brings about by necessity a sense of other as well. So that right from the beginning, as Trungpa Rinpoche said, we've grabbed the wrong end of the stick. We are already in a state of what he later in the chapter calls fundamental ignorance, where we don't recognize our fundamental sanity. We don't recognize our fundamental healthiness. We don't recognize the fundamentally true, pure, open nature of mind, and instead fixate on a sense of self. I think it's really important to find ways to relate to this material personally. How do we experience this? And in this regard, meditation is particularly helpful. But even if we don't meditate, if we just look at our actual experience, we can see that who we are, what we're doing, how we feel, what's in our minds, changes all the time. And that there really is no one self. The person that I am now is different from the person that I was a half hour ago. That person was maybe a little more comfortable because he was meditating, and now he has to speak. But who we are when we wake up, let alone if we look over a greater scope of time, who we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, what motivated us, what we felt, how we saw things, what we understood, what we were doing, what we thought was important. All of this is in constant flux. So when we fixate on a sense of self, it's literally a moment-to-moment experience that changes all the time. And it happens because we lose awareness. When we're able to settle into awareness, when we have some clarity, we're able to actually see that the sense of self is a constantly changing thing. And that's perhaps our first glimpse of egolessness. But in any case, once we have the sense of self, and once we try to solidify that, then we begin, as Trungpa Rinpoche says, we begin to look outward and grasp at the world as a way to maintain ourselves. The goal of ego, as we said in the previous chapter, is to really become comfortably numb, to find a way of secure kind of cocoon of predictability, security, and comfort. And if ego was a permanent ongoing thing, it would be a great strategy. But because of the truth of impermanence and because of the inevitability of suffering, things fall apart. And that's what he says. So we have to constantly build and rebuild and rebuild. The more it breaks down, the more we have to rebuild. And in that, and as that rebuilding takes place, suffering returns. So again and again, we have to go back to rebuilding. And that's actually our experience when we experience loss of awareness. That is our experience. It's a vicious cycle, as he says. It's a vicious cycle. So at this point, he says the path or journey becomes important because it breaks down fixation, and in particular, fixation on self, fixation on a fixed sense of who we are, a fixed sense of the world that actually is created and recreated moment to moment to moment. This is the fundamental origin of suffering, is clinging to a sense of self. And we can see this when we practice meditation, because in meditation, we allow ourselves to settle. We allow ourselves to experience the natural clarity of mind, and we begin to see things one moment at a time, rather than being caught up in a storyline or caught up in a dream. So we're able to see how these things come together and fall apart. Because otherwise, we're too distracted, too speedy, too caught up in the drama of the moment to recognize the fundamental impermanence of the self. So as Trungpa Rinpoche says, we have to understand the working of samsara. We have to know how samsara operates. Then we'll know how to work with it. We'll know what to overcome and what to cultivate. Once I heard one talk on the Four Noble Truths that were presented it as analogous to a visit to a doctor, that with the first noble truth, the doctor explores our symptoms, which is the truth of suffering. The second noble truth is a diagnosis. And what we're doing now is diving deeper into the diagnosis, you could say. The third noble truth is a prognosis. Is there a, what's the outcome? That there is a cessation of suffering. And then the fourth noble truth is like a prescription. But it's important to understand the diagnosis. It's important to understand how ego works. It's important to understand what drives us to perpetually recreate suffering, which is the title of this chapter. And as Trungpa Rinpoche says, the path or journey breaks down fixation, the fixation of holding on to oneself, holding on to others, which could be said to be the origin of suffering. In regard to this, in terms of meditation practice, he says, once you see through it, it's just a game rather than a serious plan that you have. Simply perceiving it through your mind and seeing the futility of it, realizing it's just a game, is the saving grace. So there are two types of kunjung that he talks about in this chapter, two types of origin of all, two types of arising. And the first is the 6 root kleshas. Kleshas, I think sometimes kleshas are thought of as emotions, but they're really more than that. As he says, the kleshas are actually a state of mind or a state of being. When we're in the grips of kleshas, it literally affects our perceptions. It affects the flow of our thoughts, the type of thoughts that we have. It creates a particular momentum, you could say, in a particular direction, so that the klesha, the energy of the klesha becomes somewhat self-reinforcing until it finally wears itself out. And it's also important to note that the kleshas tend to be interconnected, which is why he presents them as one leading into another. In the drawing of the wheel of life, the three fundamental kleshas, passion, aggression, and ignorance, are depicted as a rooster representing passion, a snake representing aggression, and a pig representing ignorance. And they're all biting each other's tail. So the idea is that kleshas beget kleshas. If we don't interrupt the flow of kleshas with awareness, then the flow of kleshas perpetuates itself. As he says in this chapter, sometimes kleshas seem to magically manifest out of the blue and come to your attention, but that happens because we're ready for them. And in this sense, there's actually a lot of meaning in that statement. One thing it relates to is the power of flickering thoughts that we read about last week. If you remember, the kind of internal dialogue, all the little thoughts, the subconscious gossip, that acts as a pilot light. And what happens is we get caught up in something, and suddenly this little pilot light turns into a big flame of the klesha. There are 6 root kleshas, which we'll talk about in a moment, and 20 secondary kleshas, which if you're interested, you can read the footnote. But all the secondary kleshas are just kind of different ways in which the 6 root kleshas can manifest. And as he says, they're minute at the beginning, but they have disastrous consequences. When I was at seminary, Trungpa Rinpoche asked us for what is the definition of klesha. And one person said tormenting conceptions. And Trungpa Rinpoche said, well, yes, but not necessarily at the beginning. And that's one of the reasons that we sometimes are fooled by the kleshas, that at first the klesha seems to work. We may, related to passion, for instance, find some object that gives us some kind of pleasure. And the suffering comes later, as Trungpa Rinpoche says. And then some kleshas bring suffering almost immediately. But they're interconnected. They're conflicting emotions. We can sometimes feel passionate and then very quickly switch into aggression toward the very same person, the very same object. So they're chaotic, not stable. As he says, these happen because we're jumpy and looking for entertainment. But that altogether, the kleshas bring disturbance and chaos. They keep the mind agitated. So the 6 root kleshas that he presents in this chapter are desire or passion, which he describes as actually being more like lust. And desire or passion, again, it's really an entire state of mind. In the Abhidharma description of passion, it said that when we're really in the throes of passion, we look at whatever the object is that we're feeling desirous of. So it could be a person, it could be an article of clothing, it could be a car, it could be a job, it could be anything that we are attracted to. But when we're really in the throes of passion, we see it as perfect. We ignore any kind of defect, and we create all kinds of ideas around it about how if we just had this thing, everything would be so good and everything would be so perfect and we would be so happy. In the same way, anger and aggression is the opposite of that, but it's similar in that, again, the klesha isn't just a feeling, it affects our perceptions, our ideas, our conceptions of things. With aggression, then we see the whatever it is that we are feeling angry at or aggressive toward, it's all bad. We don't see any kind of redeeming quality. We just see it as dangerous or loathsome or completely undesirable and want to push it away. Ignorance, as he says, the ignorance here in the level of the 6 kleshas is not the fundamental ignorance that begins with fixating on a sense of self, but is a more of a, so it's not that basic bewilderment, but it's rather just a way of simply boycotting situations or ignoring things, refusing to see things in an intelligent way. So there's kind of a laziness or a dullness to ignorance on this level. He talks about the klesha of pride as just being just full of yourself. And again, it's a way to hold ego, to hold on to a sense of self by not allowing any kind of vulnerability or pushing away anything that you see as potential threat, so that one becomes full of oneself and is unable to relate skillfully to the world. Um, the klesha of doubt refers to not trusting any alternatives, he says, and not wanting advice, doubting the teachings, doubting the teacher, doubting the Buddha Dharma. This is an example of what he says, that once we're in the throes of the kleshas, that sometimes we see undesirable things as desirable and desirable things as undesirable. So when we're in the throes of doubt, fundamentally is really a doubt about ourselves. Then we're unable to appreciate the teachings, unable to appreciate the practice, unable to appreciate the opportunity that practice provides to us, because of the sense of doubt, because of doubt in ourselves, doubt in the world around us. So again, it shuts us out from being able to relate properly and sanely to things. And then the last klesha that he talks about is view, or opinion. Where again, you have a particular opinion which you just solidify and hold on to, and that this becomes a way to maintain oneself in the face of the chaos, impermanence, and incessant change that we face in the world around us. So those are the six kleshas: desire, anger, pride, ignorance, doubt, and opinion. Or passion, aggression, ignorance, different words for the same thing. And it's important to note that even though at times we can see how the kleshas bring us harm, that in a lot of ways we're really attached to the kleshas. One teaching that I attended once, the teacher said that the problem with the kleshas is that we think they work for us. We think that aggression actually helps us protect our territory. We think that passion allows us to draw in desirable things. We think that we can ignore what we see as insignificant, and that it doesn't have a consequence, that it doesn't cause us to have difficulty related to things properly. Going back to the previous chapter where Trungpa Rinpoche talked about the loss of awareness, which is the beginning of this whole thing. He talked about how we then become uncoordinated in the world. We become unsynchronized, and we're unable to relate properly to things, relate properly to the world around us. And all of this comes because we cling to a sense of self. Understanding how the kleshas work, understanding the effect that they have on us, understanding how they bring suffering, is part of what we need to come to understand in order to develop renunciation and develop the motivation to practice, to begin to see through them. So I think that's what I have to say about the kleshas. Want to continue, or I don't know if... John, you're muted.
Yeah. You want me to continue at this point?
Yeah, I think so. I think that basically says, that's what I had to say.
All right. Thank you, Michael. That was great. 1 second here. Barry, do you want to make me the speaker? Thank you. So I'm just going to recapitulate a little bit that it all starts from the Buddhist perspective with a mistaken belief that I exist. And what exist means is that I am ongoing, that there is a core of me that is unchanging, that is single, unitary, and independent. And what Buddhism says is that all of that is a myth, a fiction that we create in our minds It's a story that we tell ourselves and we tell others about I and my existence. I only exists, and when we tell this story in the past and the future, and when we think about it in the present, I, even that present is slightly past. And when we come completely present here in our awareness, I evaporates. There's no room for it when we are completely awake in the present moment. Now, because it's a fiction, and because it has within it the constant desire to maintain itself, it's always looking for some way to do that. And the way in which I chooses to maintain itself is by finding an other to relate to. And we find many, many, many others to relate to out there. If that's out there, then I, the perceiver, am here. And so we're constantly engaged in these relationships of all different kinds. These relationships are what are called the kleshas. There are different styles of them, and Michael just went through the 6 styles that were presented in this chapter. There's a more traditional style where we talk about the realms and the 6 realms, and these are realms of emotional worlds that we can inhabit in the moment. We can inhabit them for years, and we can inhabit them physically in our bodies. So we are in the human realm, which is the realm of the emotion of the klesha of passion. And so as an example, passion is a relationship between I, this mythical I, and other, in which we are constantly trying to draw the other to us. We see it as enhancing our well-being, the well-being of me, of I. And so we want to draw that steak dinner to us, that lover to us, that beautiful sunset, and we want to appreciate it because that there proves that I here am here enjoying it. But there are 5 different other kleshas. The worst of them is the klesha of the hell realm, which is hatred, aggression. And in the hell realm, we see the other as threatening, as enemy. And we're frightened by it. And it causes us pain because it takes away from us, it diminishes us. And so we hate that other and we practice aggression toward it. And there are these different emotional styles. These are the kleshas. And there are the kleshas as they're described here in this chapter as well. But they all have as their raison d'etre, their reason for being, that they prove that I am here. If that's there, I am here. And they're just different styles of that relationship, of keeping that game going. Later in one of these chapters, he talks about ping pong. And ping pong is that's there, therefore I am here. And what I'm going to do with that there proves that I am here again, and on, back and forth, ping pong, I and other. And it's fundamentally painful. Even when it's pleasurable, there's an element of pain to it because we are trying to reify a lie. The lie is me, I, this fictional, ongoing, independent, unitary being. When in fact, what is real is this present moment in all its multiplicity and spaciousness, without the existence of I or other as things that exist, enduring in time. Rather, everything is a modulation of this field of awareness that we inhabit all the time. And that field we're going to come to later when we go into the 2nd volume of the Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Knowledge. We go to the 2nd volume of the Profound Treasury and we start to study what's called shunyata, emptiness, voidness. And what it's empty of is not the world, it's empty of I and other, these fictions, and how the world presents as a constantly changing, vivid presentation in which there is no substance but constant a change in constant appearance and vividness, and that vividness is called luminosity, lucidity, but nothing has any true being. That's the voidness or the absence of shunyata. We'll be coming to that much more later. But it's implied in here, because really what suffering is the denial of that reality. It's the constant reassertion that I am an ongoing thing when I show, which I'm not. So that's painful, because we're trying to reaffirm and reassert something that isn't true. And that other is also ongoing and existing in that same way. So these passions, which are really the relationship between this fictional I and other, the constant game of trying to keep this polar relationship alive. I hate this other thing. I love this thing. I hate X. I love Y. I'm hungry for Z, whatever it might be. This constant I and the relational problem keeps the whole myth of I and other alive. And that's why it's maintained in ignorance and suffering. The suffering lies in the fact that it's not really true. So we're constantly on a journey of reaffirming these relationships between I and other. Some of these relationships are painful. Some of them are seemingly pleasurable, but even that pleasure has within it the seed of pain. Now, these kleshas, the idea is that ego, the belief in an I, produces these kleshas, or they are concomitant with it, and that out of the kleshas comes karma. Karma means that there is an action and a reaction, a cause and a result. Cause and result only exists within the illusion of I and other. It's part of the illusion of ignorance, of suffering. In the real world, cause and effect are simply not there. There is this matrix of interaction, and we can understand it and explore it. But the idea of cause and effect as it affects me is gone. We are simply fluid in the present moment. We are, in anything, if anything, more intelligent in this present moment, because we can understand and see how the interaction between all the different parts that are happening in the present moment works. So, unfortunately, though, we begin to believe in agency, in cause and effect, and this is karma. And if we do, this is the karma is produced by the kleshas. So, for instance, if we are engaged in aggression towards something, we provoke a reaction. That other thing that we're aggressing reacts and attacks back. And that is the karmic consequence of our aggression. If we practice pride, and we are, emanating pride in our well-being, this produces karmic effects as well. And the world around us reacts to our pride in one way or another. Either they buy into it or they reject it. And we feel those reactions. And so karma begins with the ignorance that produces ego. This is avidya, which causes our volitional action. And then the entire chain reaction of karma, which is described in the 12 nidanas that we went through earlier, evolves. And we are caught in them, we are stuck in them. And they all begin with that mistaken assertion that I exist. And if I exists, then there is an other, and we suddenly have, in the midst of this fluid space, we suddenly have concrete things existing, this I and this other. And this is the birth of what's called name and form, the second nidana. And the chain goes all the way through these 12 steps to birth at the end, and then finally death. and then the reassertion of the chain all over again. This is what is called karmic momentum. We're constantly trying to perpetuate pleasure and avoid pain, even down to the smallest details of what we're going to have for dinner, how we arrange our bedding, our clothing, whatever it might be. This process takes place all the time. It is both the product of suffering and it produces suffering. And it's important to see this clearly. And in fact, seeing the whole process of our karma and our suffering and our false belief in ego, when we see that with complete clarity, we're not in it. We have stepped out of it and we have become part of the true world, the world of openness and clarity, and ultimately of shunyata. So this is why we are enjoined, as we were last week, again and again, to watch and to see our thoughts down to the minutest detail of wanting this, not wanting that, of hating the other, of fearing the whatever it might be, seeing these little flickers of thoughts, because when we see them without reactivity, when we come present out of the dream, we have awoken from suffering, if only momentarily. Awareness is the cure for suffering. Awareness is what takes us into enlightened mind. And so we practice awareness towards everything, towards the objects of the five senses as they arise in the moment, towards all our thoughts and emotions. And in the act of practicing that awareness, we are momentarily free from suffering, awakened in whatever degree we are. Now, then he goes through the different patterns of karma. There are fundamentally two types of karma, unmeritorious and meritorious. And the meritorious are just the reverse of the unmeritorious. And the idea is like, for instance, taking life, unmeritorious karma of the body, taking life, killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. The idea is that these are all expressions, again, of egotism. And so they reify this belief in a self, and they produce reactions which seem to confirm it, reactions back. And there are different forms of self-aggrandizement, but all of them are connected with the scheme of accepting and rejecting. And all of these 10 unmeritorious karmas, the ones connected with speech have to do with telling lies to defend your particular cause, again, reasserting your own self. Intrigue, based on trying to break down opposition to you, to me, and we engage in all kinds of little schemes and intrigues and plans and plots against the people we feel are harmful to us, inimical to us. Speaking negative words, harsh words, you use them as weapons that you hope will give power over others. Again, it's the game of ego, trying to assert and maintain itself. And gossip, he describes as anything other than functional talking. Functional talking is pass the salt, you're stepping on my toe. What's the weather going to be today? Those are functional talking. Anything other than that is gossip. And it has, again, the purpose of luring others into discursive thought with you so that you can enjoy this gossiping, and keep it going, the chatter. That's a low form of entertainment. And then there are the three that are connected with mind, which are envy. Unmeritorious karma is produced by envy, where you envy someone else, you have a poverty mentality, you feel that you're less than, they are greater than, and you want to attack them, bring them down, and raise yourself up. The hoping to create harm, which is sort of the same thing, and disbelieving in truth or sacredness. This is unmeritorious karma of the mind. And the meritorious karma is just the reverse. So instead of taking life, we develop respect for life. Instead of stealing, we practice generosity, and so forth. Now, the point about these I'm not going to go through them all. They're very obvious and you can see them in the reading. But the point of meritorious and unmeritorious karma is that they both reaffirm ignorance, belief in an ego. Neither one of them is fundamentally bringing you to awakening or enlightenment. However, meritorious karma creates what in the Hinayana teachings is called a healthy mind, kusala chitta in the Sanskrit. It means a healthy mind. Now, what a healthy mind is a mind that is open, that is receptive, that is inclined towards meditative awareness, as opposed to the unmeritorious karma. It leads you into an unhealthy mind. And this is a mind which is shut down, which is focused on self, and which sees the world in terms of itself. Kusala chitta, healthy mind, is a mind that is much more inclined to treading the path and to opening and to the next stage of the path, which is to begin to understand emptiness and the truth and reality, what reality really is. As long as we practice unmeritorious karma, we are consolidating, we are reaffirming all those things which give strength and birth to our ignorance, our belief in a self, our combative belief about the world, seeing it in terms of the kleshas, and it just perpetuates the suffering of that misery. So then he talks about 6 types of karmic consequence, and these are very predictable, he says, these karmic consequences, because our world is created out of passion, aggression, and ignorance. And that is this, that the passion and the aggression and the ignorance is a translation, and it's sometimes used to translate the fundamental ignorance, which is called not seeing, avidya in Sanskrit, marikpa in Tibetan. And they translate that as ignorance into English. And what it means is that this type of ignorance is, again, not seeing this open dimension of our being, of constantly seeing the world as a polarity, a game between I and other, a ping pong game. That is the fundamental ignorance. And they also call that ignorance error, Trungpa in Tibetan. And the error is that we think that this I exists and that therefore so does other, and vice versa. The other type of ignorance, which is being talked about here, is one of what's called the 3 poisons. And the 3 poisons are simply this, that once you believe that I exist and therefore other, or that other is there and therefore I, as long as that happens, then there are 3 possible relationships you can have. You can see that other as favorable to your continued existence and you want to draw it to you. And this is the first poison that's called passion. The second one is that you see the other as inimical to your continued existence and you want to push it away from you. And that's called aggression. And the third is that you see the other as indifferent, as not really mattering much. And that is the third poison, which is translated as ignorance, but the Sanskrit for it is moha. Or I forget what the Tibetan is. He gives the Tibetan actually. At Tulsik. And what's being talked about here is these 3, passion, aggression, and ignorance, these 3 poisons. They're very predictable. Our world is, samsaric world, our confused world, is based on these 3 poisons: aggression, pushing away, passion, pulling to you, and indifference. I think indifference is a much better translation for moha. And so there are different ways of organizing and understanding karma. And this is very commonsensical. And if you've read the chapter, the first one is the power of volitional action. It has 4 subcategories. You can have a good beginning and a bad end. And he says, so for instance, you're born a human being, but in bad circumstances. So, you might lose all your money, or you are born into poverty and have to struggle just to survive. And then you can have a bad beginning, but a good ending. And he says, for example, you're born into a mafia family, bad beginning, but you use the resources that you have to do good things. So that's a bad beginning, but a good ending. It's kind of funny. And then there's a bad ending and a bad ending, like you're born into some terrible hellish circumstances and being forced to remain in those circumstances. And there are plenty of people who suffer that circumstance, that situation. And finally, there is a good beginning and a good ending, that you're born into a human birth and you take advantage of it and you can achieve spiritual awakening, as an example. And then there is the aspect of karma, that you experience what you have sown, what you have planted, karmic seeds. So you can experience the results of the three poisons on the spot. You can experience your regression. You enact aggression towards an other and they attack back. You seduce another to you and you have sex, whatever it might be. You can experience the results of the three poisons on the spot. You can experience them later. So, for instance, you commit an act of aggression now and there's no immediate consequence, but it comes back to you later in some way. And finally, you can experience consequences ripening from a previous birth. And that means that you did something in the past and you receive the consequences of it now, in the present. This can be depending on whether you take it as credible that you had past lives. And in fact, they say in the teachings that the karma that you experience now, in the moment, is not the most immediate necessarily. It's the weightiest, meaning the things that you did in the past, which are of the most import and have the most weight, they are what are coming to life right now. There are white karmic consequences, which means that you have good karma. So if you practice the Buddhist path, that's supposed to produce good karma. If you are appreciating and emulating someone else's virtue, that produces good karma. Altogether, practicing the Dharma means that you will have good karma because you're clearing your wandering mind. You're coming more into the present and appreciating this life. You can change karmic flow by forceful action. Sometimes you're experiencing a difficult situation and it's very emotionally turbulent. And if you can come present and create a gap in your reactivity, you can do something that will change the karma of that situation. I'll give you an example of that you can experience. There are these, and I've talked about this before, but there are the slogans of Atisha. They're called the Lojong slogans, training the mind. And one of my favorites is driving all blames into one. And what that means is that in a situation of conflict where there is blame happening, and you know that other person is at fault, you can take the blame. And when you do, the consequences of that act, the repercussions, can be really shocking. It can open the situation up in ways that you never expected. And Trungpa Rinpoche exhorts us to do that, to try it, to take the blame, even when you absolutely know that it's the other person's fault, and you say, I'm sorry, it's my fault. It's so difficult to do, but it opens a gap in the karmic flow. If you don't do that, then it's just you're caught in the karma of the blame, back and forth, back and forth. You did this, I did that, and so forth. And it's really solid and ongoing. And the only way, or at least a powerful way, to interrupt that neurotic dance is to take the blame. And the funny thing is that in the times when I've done it, there's almost no negative consequence. You think it's going to be terrible, but but I caution you, don't do it in a situation where there could be legal consequences, like somebody's going to sue you or something like that. Finally, or almost finally, there are shared karmic situations. We have national karma. We've got the karma of this little meditation group. We've got the karma of our town, our village, and we share those karmas. And we participate in them both as a group and individually. And finally, the last one is the interaction of intention and action has four subcategories. You have a white or a healthy, helpful intention, and it produces a white result. I mean, it's a good result. Just like if you take the blame, you're doing it out of generosity or perhaps because you want to be more dharmic, and it opens up the situation and produces friendship. A black intention produces a black action. And he says you murdered someone or you destroyed something and you reap the consequences. And finally, a white intention and a black action. You kill a person to save many. That's in one example. The intention is white, the action is black, and it has a positive effect. And very finally, the black intention and the white action, being generous to your enemy while you're trying to poison him. So you can have a black intention and you can perform a white action, but still it's nasty. All 6 types of karmic consequence are produced by being partly in a wrong environment and partly by your own neurosis. Hard to change. The only way to do so is by rousing the personal inspiration to try and change one's karma, by coming present, by awakening, by creating some generous act like taking the blame. So to review, the origin of suffering, which is this mistake. The mistake is the arising of the belief in either I or other. It's described in both ways, that suddenly it could be a belief in other. Here you are in this open dimension. This is emptiness, shunyata. Nothing has any of its own existence, a constant fluxing. But suddenly there's that thing out there that really exists and it has import. It means something for you. It emerges from the field and suddenly there's an object of awareness and a background, a separation of figure and ground. That thing which seems to exist implies the existence of the perceiver, me, here. That there, therefore I'm here. We do this all the time. And it's very subtle and low key. And if I'm here and that's there, then what's my relationship to that there? And we go back and forth. This is the ping pong. So that if that's there, I want to reach out and feel it. Is it for me, against me, or neutral? 3 poisons. And the message comes back, whatever it is. If it's for me, well then, I want to draw it to me. And we go further. And the whole thing begins to develop and become complicated and is described, this process, both in the description of the development of karma, the 12 nidanas, and also in the description of the development of the belief in an I, which is called the 5 skandhas. And we've covered these before, but we can certainly go back over and over them. So, how do we unplug? And the only way, is through shamatha vipassana meditation. Shamatha means coming back from the dream to awareness in the present moment, to now. Awakening from the dream. We do it all the time. We're walking down the street and suddenly you wake up from the dream. Here we are. That is what is necessary. And then, having awoken from the dream, the practice of awareness, that we begin to see this world as it truly is, stripped of our dreams, stripped of our preconceptions, our value judgments, which are all part of the kleshas, the karma. We begin to see it as it really is. And that kind of vivid seeing awakens us. It brings us into a more wholesome and healthy state of mind, to say the least. And it frees us from suffering, because the suffering is constantly about me, I, trying to solidify me, make me safe, pleasurable, comfortable. And we can give that up as we come present. That's an act of constant loss of awareness, constant devolving into dream. And so we come back into the present moment and we achieve peace, suffering, because we're no longer caught in thought, in dreams. Those thoughts, those dreams contain endless sorrow. They're just riddled with it. And so when we come back to awareness, we achieve a surcease, relief. And then also in coming back into awareness, we cease to do harm to others. These are the two main benefits of the Hinayana stage of the path: release from our own personal suffering and the stopping or the cessation of harming others. Because as long as we're caught in the kleshas, or even the most benign of them, we are doing a violence to others. We're seeing them in terms of our own schemes. And we're even manipulating them in terms of our own schemes. If it's passion, we're trying to seduce that other into our world. If it's aggression, we want to destroy it. If it's envy, we want to destroy it and take it over and get what it's got that we didn't have. And so the passions are always, always inimical to harming and harmful of others. So the two virtues of treading the path, even at the very beginning stage, is that we cease to suffer and we stop harming others. This is the Hinayana stage of the path. Now, going into this last chapter, which is very short, this has to do with awakening and blossoming. And this is what we do. We awaken into this present moment, and we blossom by beginning to appreciate it and interact with it as it truly is, instead of in terms of the kleshas, which are all about ego's manipulation and self-aggrandizement. And so this is what the third noble truth is about. It's about beginning to come present, coming out of suffering, and beginning to come into reality. We could get rid of the fictitious stories of how great it is to get there and become somebody at last, he says. This is cessation. Don't romanticize it. Don't make it into something glorious that I'm going to get. Because if we do that, then we're falling prey to spiritual materialism, the use of spirituality itself for self-aggrandizement, for the bolstering of ego. He says, imagination does not play a role, does not help at all in getting results. The experience of cessation is very personal and real, like the practice of meditation. It's just as real as that. It doesn't involve fantasy or dream. He says, generally, we experience it at this stage of the path, the beginning stage, as being very minute, sparse, just flashes. And we even wonder if that was real. Or if we think that it was real, then we want to hold on to it. We see it in the rearview mirror, and it becomes a source of suffering. And then we think, it wasn't real. So it's possible to extend those glimpses. And the way we extend them, guess what? The practice of meditation, coming back again and again, both on the cushion or in our chair and in our daily lives. As we walk the streets of our lives, as we brush our teeth, as we cook our meals, we come back. Come back. It's not theoretical, it's very real. It's like experiencing instantaneous good health, he says, although there are no guarantees. And the word Sangye, which is Tibetan for Buddha, literally means awake and blossoming. And that's what we're doing. We are coming awake out of the dream and we're blossoming. Blossoming means appreciating the beauty of this present moment and interacting with it in a way that is accurate, appreciative. Then he talks about the three categories of samsara. The word for samsara is korwa in Tibetan. Korwa means a circle because that's what samsara is. We're constantly chasing something that doesn't exist. And so you can't catch it. That's what I is. You can never find I. If you try and see I, it's an ever receding point. It's like trying to see your own eyeballs. You can't see them. You look at I, and then there's a new I seeing it, always receding, inner and inner. So the essence of Sara, there are three qualities of samsara. The essence of samsara is bewilderment, ignorance, stupidity. We're caught in this back and forth, and it makes us stupid. It makes us bewildered. It makes us unavailable in the present moment to the subtleties of what's arising now, because we're constantly lost in the dream. And fixation, which is we're holding on to something, some dream, and we're caught in it, and we bounce back and forth like a ping pong ball, he says, trying to realize the dream in one way or another. And then finally, the third aspect of samsara is suffering, that because of this constant feeling of insecurity, that I am not well, that I am not solid, that I am not healthy, that I am not happy, we suffer. We constantly feel we're not there. And the only way to actually be there is to give up that game and come back into awareness. And this is done through the practice of meditation, of mindfulness and awareness meditation. It's the only way. When I first heard him say that this is the only way, I reacted negatively. I thought, oh my gosh, this sounds like fundamentalism, true believerism. But in fact, it's not, because the only way is the way of giving up all of that true belief, fundamentalism, and coming back to simple, ordinary awareness that is with us all the time. He says the main point is to experience cessation rather than have a theory or dream about it. So, and that's the thing. When you experience it, you're giving up the appreciation, the feeling like, oh, I've got something. You can't do that. You can't do it at the same time. That feeling of, oh, I've got something is samsara again. It's all about me and holding on. So it's all about letting go into awareness. This is why we work with the out-breath in mindfulness awareness practice. We go out with the breath dissolves, and at the end, let go. And you're letting go into awareness. He calls it gap. I don't use that word when I lead the meditation because I'm afraid it's going to confuse people. But that's what Trungpa Rinpoche always called it, the gap. You let go into the unnameable. If you can name it, then you're back in the game of I and other and ego. It's just this. That's why we work with the out-breath. It dissolves ego. If we work with the in-breath, which we do in shamatha, pure shamatha, it has the effect of reifying ego, because I'm here trying to be aware of my breath. And we count the breaths, we even. So we start with that because it brings us back from dreaming, but then we begin to let it go into Vipassana. And Vipassana is the profound practice. It takes us all the way to the end of the path. You could say that a Buddha, awake and blossoming, is the ultimate expression or manifestation of Vipassana meditation. It's Vipassana perfected. And then finally, I'll just read this last quote. He says, the third noble truth is very simple. Nirvana is possible. We need to get this message, and we do so by experiencing cessation of suffering in glimpses. It is possible. We can do it. And we experience it in glimpses. And then we say, oh, that happened. And so he finally sums up the last sentence. The Buddha said cessation could be experienced. This is the Four Noble Truths. He said that suffering should be known. The origin of suffering should be renounced. That's the ego. The cessation of suffering should be realized, coming present. And the path should be regarded as the truth to resolution. And the path is no more than constantly coming back again and again to this open awareness in the present moment. So we can have a discussion.
Well, this is just a little more chatty and gossipy maybe, but I'll get us going. John spoke last week a little bit about, he was just sharing a story about an author, George Saunders, out of one of his, his most recent book. And when Michael was speaking about how we're different, right? Not who we were 5 minutes ago, an hour ago. Part of Saunders' writing process is to revisit his piece daily for an extended period, 8 months, a year, however long it is. And his notion is he can get all the Georges involved in it. And then what they produce together is much greater than what he could do on his own.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, he's wonderful. And he's so patient. My God, he just goes over it and over it and over it. Yeah. Yeah. So you've read that book?
I just love him. Yeah, so everything, and listen to all the interviews too.
Yeah, this is my first introduction to him. I'm very impressed. And he seems to be a Buddhist. He mentions Buddhism in early on, but then doesn't mention it again. So I'm wondering what his connection is.
Apparently,
Huh?
like when they were just married or had young kids, his wife took up a meditation practice, and he's like, within days, she was a different person. Makes you feel like, oh, I'm dragging behind. But she was profoundly impacted by it. And I think he took it up as a practice too.
Wow.
He mentions it several times. There's a couple of interviews on YouTube. He did a thing with Anne Lamott, in conversation with Anne Lamott. I'll send you the link. But he mentions clearly, he mentions clearly being a Buddhist.
Yeah. Valerie and I are fans of Anne Lamott. Yeah, that's interesting. Connections everywhere. That's wonderful. Anybody else?
Hey, just a comment. You said that your reaction when you first heard that, like, basically, this is the only way, that you had a reaction, how is that different than fundamentalism? And that was my reaction when you just said it too. So how is it different than fundamentalism?
Because in other circumstances, and when people say this is the only way, it involves subscription to a belief and a system, perhaps, and an organization. This involves, it's the only way, is realizing that coming back out of belief and into awareness in the present moment, which involves a tremendous letting go of ground, of I and other, and a step into what is real and out of the fictions of thought. That's what he meant. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can see that it would be like if it's fundamentalism, you're clinging, you're holding on to something. Whereas with this with this meditation is you're actually relinquishing everything.
Indeed.
It's
And there are
pretty,
all kinds of things, like in the Zen tradition, there's a slogan I've always loved. In the end, there is no Buddha, there is no Dharma, there is nothing profound. You know? And the ox herding pictures, you've seen the woodcuts. He starts out by chopping wood and carrying water, and that's where he winds up, chopping wood and carrying water.
mhm.
I mean, it's all about giving up egotism and its self-aggrandizement in every way,
Yeah.
including dogmaticism and true believerism. And he mentions that here in this chapter. He says, beware of spiritual materialism. Same thing. We can't hear you.
There's something wrong, Laura. You're unmuted, but we can't hear you.
Now you're muted.
Oh, well, I think she gave up.
Oh,
Bummer.
bummer. Unmute yourself.
Jane has had her hand up. And
Okay.
Laura put something in chat, maybe.
Okay. So.
Yes, thank you, Valerie. I read and reread on page 414 the paragraph about meritorious karma, and I'm having a lot of trouble understanding it. Can you help me with this?
Let me see what he says. How about Michael? Do you want to take this?
I can try. It's said that it takes a fully realized Buddha to fully understand karma, but you're stuck with me, I guess. Sorry. But what in particular
Well,
was?
starting with the first sentence, he says, next we have the 10 meritorious deeds of karma. Although they are meritorious, less you should still regard all of them as producing further suffering, further karma, whether you act virtuously or whether you act in a degraded manner, still producing pain and suffering. And then he goes on with many examples that he says are simple. The simple reverse of the 10 evil acts. Instead of taking a life, for instance, you respect life. Instead of stealing, you practice generosity. So my question is, why does, let's say, doing good in the world produce pain and suffering?
Well, I still think, first of all, it does produce a relative benefit that can ultimately lead to liberation. But in some ways, I think studying the Mahayana makes this a little bit clearer. That, for instance, in the Mahayana, when they talk about generosity, the perfection of generosity is generosity with no notion of gift, no notion of giver, and no notion of recipient. You just do what the situation calls for without any expectation of reward, any expectation of response. And what I think it is a little hard to understand where the suffering comes in here, but part of it is there still is a clinging to ego. So it's maybe not as solid a sense of ego as what you get with the unmeritorious karma. But there's still some sense of somebody doing something. And that in itself still creates enough of a sense of ego and enough a sense of momentum that it still leaves open the door to suffering. So I think that's probably the best way I can understand it. Until we get a fully realized Buddha who can explain all these things to us. The other thing I'll say about karma is it can get really hard to understand because we come to thinking about karma with all kinds of Western ideas, about sin and eternalism and good and bad and fairness and unfairness. And really it's, in one sense, it's simpler than that. It's just that certain actions produce certain results. And one of the results of karma is that we're conditioned by karma. The more we do something, the easier it is to do it again. And which is why the unmeritorious karma is so serious, that the more we become used to, habituated, conditioned to causing harm, hurting other people, taking advantage of other people, speaking negatively about other people, the more conditioned we are to do it again and again. But even the positive deeds have a little bit of that same momentum. I think that's what he's saying.
Thank you. It's something I think I just have to struggle with. And
I think what he's saying is that, if you do positive deeds, if there's a feeling of self-appreciation as you do them, I'm a good person, then they're reaffirming the belief in ego. See, and also there's a suspicious quality to it, isn't there? I mean, when a person does it because they want to be on the side of right, they become sort of a goody two shoes, and there's something saccharine and distrustful about it, as opposed to, as Michael said, in the Mahayana, we're going to get to the description of generosity without giver, the receiver, and the act of giving. It's just complete openness and involvement in the present moment. Complete openness is an act of giving, but it's beyond any sense of I. That's the problem in the Hinayana with this meritorious karma. I is still very much present. I. I'm being good. I'm being holy. I'm doing a virtuous thing. I'm being generous, whatever it might be. That's
something you do out of, let's say, compassion. If I see a pregnant lady on the street in Manhattan on a blanket and it's whatever, and she's begging, and I give her something, I feel compassion. I don't feel, wow, I'm like such a great person because I have compassion. I have compassion, and therefore I'll do certain things.
Yeah.
So by calling them meritorious, it like gives it a bad name, or am I?
No, it's a good name, because even if there is ego, and there may or may not be ego mixed in, it's completely up to you, But even if there is, meritorious karma diminishes egotism, or it can, it should. And that's why they call it developing a healthy mind. It's a mind that's more inclined to coming present and treading the path to egolessness.
Thank you.
So it's just a matter of, for each one of us, observing as we give that woman money, what's going on inside. I remember once I was talking with a man named Pakchok Rinpoche. He used to come and speak at Eileen Fisher. And we were walking, and he said, how do you like living in New York? And I said, well, I like New York very much, but it has its painful side too. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, I walk down the street and there are suffering everywhere. And I said, I keep money in my pocket readily available because I don't like struggling and making a big scene to reach my wallet. I just want to reach in and hand somebody some money, and I feel embarrassed and I want to move on. He said, you could feel grateful to that person for giving you the opportunity to be generous. It's sweet, isn't it?
No, I get that. I really do.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Michael, thank you. It is I think that it's very complex. I think that there's a lot of complexity to that.
Thank you. Mary, did you have a question?
Laura put something in chat.
Looks like Steve raised his hand, and Tony has a question.
Okay.
And Danielle also.
To kind of piggyback off of what Jane said, I'm wondering, wouldn't the suffering from meritorious actions come from just whatever you do being impermanent?
If you're attached to the action or some result from the action, yes.
Yeah, and
So
also
it's all about attachment, or is it just that whatever I do for the pregnant woman will eventually be used up, or it won't, it'll ultimately not be permanent or fixed?
I think it has to do with just that as long as there's a sense of I, there is suffering. I automatically is afraid for its well-being, its life, and that in itself, that fear, that desire for self-preservation is painful and so full of suffering. We're holding on. And meritorious karma still has some sense of I in it. That's why it's still karma. Yes, does that make sense, or you have more?
Yeah, I was just wondering if because suffering lies in impermanence, if like it was just, if he was talking about just the act itself is impermanent no matter how good it is, that that's just what I was wondering, if that was the key, or if it was, but you're saying it's more about the ego being attached is the cause of the suffering.
I'm having trouble hearing you, Steve, but I think the answer is that it's the ego attachment that is the suffering. Yeah. Impermanence needn't be.
Yeah, okay.
Impermanence could be a beautiful expression of beauty. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
John?
Tony.
Oh, hi. Yeah. Some time ago, I was introduced to, and it's not something that we've talked about here today, but it keeps coming up for me. I was introduced to the notion of the precepts. And I'm wondering, it seems to me that it's possible that you could mitigate a lot of suffering and the kleshas by working with the precepts. Is that, I mean, I'm a bit of a novice in this area, but is that something that one could do?
Absolutely, you could.
Okay.
But remember, the precepts are aimed at diminishing unmeritorious karma and increasing meritorious karma, and they're still involved with karma. But still, when you do that, you are creating a better mind for treading the path, a mind more inclined to see the truth of the teachings and to tread the path to enlightenment, to wake up. So when we do meditation programs, group programs, we always start the day by taking the 5 vows for lay people, not monks or nuns. And they are not to kill, not to steal, not to lie, not to have improper sex, whatever that means anymore, and not to drink alcohol. And
intoxicants, yeah.
Intoxicants. And they say that if you break the last one, you'll probably break some or all of the other 4. That's the joke. They always say that. And then also when you do the group program, you take those vows, but if you're intending to break one of them that day, you just don't take it. Take the vow. And if you take the vow and then break it after you've taken it for the day, they only last a day. Then you have to go and confess to your meditation instructor. That's the way it's done.
Yeah.
Who could care less, probably, but unless it's really salacious, and then they might be interested.
Thanks, John.
Sure.
We're almost out of time here.
Okay. Who else had questions?
Danielle.
Danielle.
Thank you. Thanks. I just want to bring up an example of what you guys were talking about, the meritorious and getting something from it. Like when I was in school getting my social work degree, this like professor was like, you know, talking about the things that we do, why we're into this, you know, school, what we want to do, why we want to help others. We're getting something from it. And everybody was like, no, we're not. We're just doing it because it's the right thing to do. We're not. And we like kind of like argued for a while. And then after a while, I was like, well, maybe so, because it does make me feel good inside. It makes me feel like a good person. It makes me happy. And it consolidates like my identity as a social worker. If I do something good, I'm like, oh, I'm a social worker. I did good, you know, and I made the world better. So at first people were just like, no, we're not doing it to get something, you know? And then we figured it out that, yeah, we were. So that was just an example of it seems to be the thing you guys are talking about, you know? So.
Thank you.
But we didn't think so at first. We were like, no, just doing it. Thanks.
And here, I'll just read Laura's comment to everyone. She says, Trungpa Rinpoche, is pointing to the experience as the only way. The words that you use around that, the ways you come to that direct experience are many and varied.
Sure.
Peter?
Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Who else had a comment?
Oh.
Or a question?
Robert has had his hand up for a while.
Okay. And should we make this the last, Perry?
Yeah, we should. It's 9 o'clock.
Thank you. What do you see as a relationship between karma and the Dharma?
Michael, you want to feel that?
I feel like volleyball. I'll try to hit the ball up and then maybe you can hit it over.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, it's said that, again, just traditionally having some
Oh, wait.
When the Karmapa came in 1980, he had audiences with different people, and a lot of times people asked him questions. How do you work with this? How do you work with that? How do you work with this population? And over again, his answer was teach them cause and effect. You have to have some understanding of how what you're doing in the present, where you are, whether you're even present in the present, has an impact on what happens to you. So that understanding something about how causes and conditions work. And it's, you know, it sounds kind of conceptual, but the reality is in meditation, we can experience it in a very meaningful, personal way, right on the spot. Having some understanding that there's a difference in our experience when we're present as opposed to when we're not. Having some understanding that through the practice of meditation, we gradually habituate ourselves, become more familiar with being aware, as opposed to absent-minded. And that's karma. That's cause and effect. It's you know, understanding something about causes and conditions and results.
I asked that question because there's a closing chant in service in Zen, and it goes, may the merits of maintaining the precepts, and this is the word, may the merits of maintaining the precepts permeate the Dharma world, and may our vows to accomplish the Buddha way be realized together. And it's a very word permeate is very big. I mean, to permeate something, go through everything, you know. About the creation of meritorious karma. with it, because I think that a lot of times, you know, I used to have a really, I used to think of karma was always negative. So people would say, that's negative. Oh, it's karma, it's karma, it's karma. You know, like why? Because that's all that was coming back to me at some point, you know. So it had to be the negative. I was like, slap in the face, you know. But one of the things John said earlier, it really caught my attention because I heard this in other circles, that suddenly there is that thing out there that seems to exist. And I notice whenever I'm saying to myself, it seems to me that blah, 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 that it's not real.
Mhm.
It's just a reflection of something I'm thinking.
Yeah.
That I is attached to. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I think and in my own experience as to work with meditation, I've come to see that more and more.
Yeah, like there is no there's no I out, there's no other out there.
Yeah.
Well, we should end on that note.
Soon there will be no other, because we'll be gone.
Yeah, there would be no other. So could we just say the dedication of merit? Put it up on screen. And should we have, no, I think I'll mute everybody just for this. Here we go. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Michael.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you
John.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nicole.
Thanks,
Bye. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
See you in the morning.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.
Christy.
Michael, thank you. That was so helpful.
Yeah, I
Great.
actually thought of an example from work, but it was, yeah.
Very, very enlightening. Thank you. And
Very helpful.
Thank you.
good night.
Good night.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Robert.
See you all.